everybody, it's Sandy and welcome back to my channel dedicated to helping you advocate for your own health one topic at a time. So guys, by now, anybody who watches my channel, my guess is you've already seen the exciting news coming out about a couple of the vaccines that we're waiting on for COVID, and I just want to talk about that today. So I don't presume to be bringing any news. Anybody who watches my channel most likely is keeping up with the news on COVID and all those different vaccines that we're waiting on. And I'm just so excited to have heard the news that both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are over 90% effective. And I think the Moderna one, something like 94, 95. So I think that's really good news. Now, I've been asked before what my thoughts on some of these vaccines are and what I talk about them. I did a video a while back in which I had the opportunity to interview some of the researchers performing clinical trials at one of the sites for Moderna. I'm going to link that video right here. I'm so happy I had a chance to do that interview. I really learned a lot. Unfortunately, the sound is a little bit muffled on that video. They both had to be in the same room when I was interviewing them. We were on a Zoom call, and I guess just because of their proximity, of course, they were wearing masks. So that did muffle the sound a little bit, but if you can put up with that, I think there's a lot to learn out of that interview. Yeah, so I thought about doing one video just generally about all of these different vaccines, but I feel like that's a little bit too broad, and I think that I've got more to say as they come out with some of their data, their results. So I think I'm just going to dedicate this to some of my thoughts on vaccines in general, and then these particular messenger RNA vaccines, which are the two that we've heard from recently. Both Pfizer and Moderna use the messenger RNA vaccine technology. Let me just say my usual disclaimer, which is that nothing that I say on this channel should substitute for any advice of your own qualified health practitioner. Nothing that I say should be deemed as any individual medical advice. I'm not giving any individual medical advice on this channel, but I am happy to talk about my thoughts about vaccines in general. Now, I've been asked this before, and it's not going to surprise anybody who watches my channel regularly that my view on vaccines is nuanced. I am neither an anti-vaxxer, far from it. I am not an anti-vaxxer. But I also feel that some of the recommendations that we have in terms of vaccines in this country are a little bit overbroad. Now, I can give an example of that, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but bear with me here. The tetanus vaccine is something that really imparts an immunity of about 30 years. It has a half-life of about 14, 15 years, and that's why in a lot of other countries you have a full series for tetanus as a child, and then you have it once when you're 30 and once when you're 60. Now, in the United States, our recommendation is every 10 years, unless you get stuck with something, and then if it's been more than 5 and you have some kind of a puncture wound, then you're supposed to have it again. So it's could be as short a window as every 5 years. So one of the people who has researched this issue is a professor at the medical school in Oregon. And I had an opportunity to speak with him via email. He sent me his citations, and he looked at tetanus as well as other vaccines to see what kind of long-term immunity they impart, especially the ones that were given in childhood. And this was one I was particularly interested in, was tetanus. His conclusion is that what they're doing in a lot of other countries is very much sufficient, and in the United States, we could easily move to a model like that as long as we're giving a full series in infancy and childhood. Then you can give it once at 30 and once at 60. So I did a little crude experiment on myself this past year. I was due, being that it had been 10 years since my last tetanus shot, so I was due to get a tetanus shot, and I decided instead I wanted to draw titers. I had to beg and plead a little bit to get the order from my doctor to go over to the lab and draw a titer. I don't know why, but of course the titer came back completely immune. Anything over 0.1 is considered immune, and my titer was 1 point something, so like 10 times the amount I would need in order to be protected. I think that Dr. Slifka is correct. I also think that a lot of these other countries are correct in the way they're handling tetanus, and that our recommendations are overbroad. That doesn't make me an anti-vaxxer, but it just means that I think that my view is a little bit more nuanced, because I think that that particular recommendation is overly aggressive. One exception to that might be if you got some kind of a deep puncture wound, and then it has to sort of be determined on a case-by-case basis. So I'm not going to necessarily wait for the 30-year interval to come up if, let's say, I get a deep puncture wound on the 28th year of that cycle. Now, I also have some other concerns about vaccines and overbroad recommendations. I've been following the work of a Dr. Schoenfeld, who is an immunologist. I'm going to preface this by telling you that Dr. Schoenfeld is not an anti-vaxxer either. I have heard him say that he thinks vaccines are some of the best things that have ever happened to humanity. That said, he studies autoimmune disease, and he has formed an opinion that adjuvants in the vaccines have the potential to aggravate or to flare autoimmune disease. So what is an adjuvant? An adjuvant is meant to boost the immune response. Additional vaccines actually give a little bit of the illness so that you'll develop an immune response to it without getting full-blown disease. Now, along with that, they put in this adjuvant so that you will get a boosted response, so that whatever your immune system is going to do that day, in this case, make antibodies against that particular disease, it's going to boost that. Well, if you are somebody who suffers with autoimmune disease, that means you make autoantibodies. So you make antibodies against yourself. So let's say you have celiac disease. It's possible, given what you're eating in your diet, that you're making autoantibodies that are destroying your own intestines. If you have connective tissue disease like rheumatoid arthritis, you make autoantibodies that are destroying your joints. So the question is, if you are given a vaccine with an adjuvant in it, is it possible that you are also boosting autoantibodies? If you happen to be making autoantibodies that day when you get that adjuvant, is that going to get boosted as well? Well, Dr. Schoenfeld thinks yes, it is. Now, he doesn't recommend not getting vaccines. He recommends a balanced approach where you carefully weigh the risks and the benefits, and that's something that has to be discussed between patient and doctor. But my takeaway is that I question whether some of our recommendations are overbroad. I don't know that we give that enough thought before we recommend vaccines. I don't know that I feel the same way about a flu vaccine as I do about a measles vaccine, for example. So I think that this stuff is nuanced. I know that's my favorite word, but I think nuance is really important. Now, one place where you hear a whole lot about adjuvants is when vaccines are targeted toward the elderly. Because with advanced age comes lesser response to vaccines. So a vaccine given to a young person tends to elicit a much stronger response than it will in an older person. So while many vaccines have adjuvants in them, very often those that are targeted to an older population have very powerful adjuvants. So, for example, there are some flu vaccines that are targeted specifically to elderly people. What's different about those particular flu vaccines is not anything to do with the virus. In the flu vaccines that are marketed to the elderly, they have more powerful adjuvants. Not that there aren't adjuvants in almost every flu vaccine anyway, but they contain a very powerful adjuvant. The same thing is true with the newer shingles vaccine, Shingrix. Now, this is another interesting thing because that one has a novel adjuvant that is known to be super powerful, and there are anecdotal reports that people with autoimmune disease have experienced flares after receiving the Shingrix vaccine. So there's actually a clinical trial getting ready to start. I contacted one of the lead investigators on that trial, and he's telling me that hopefully in a year he's going to know something. But in the original clinical trials with Shingrix vaccine, they eliminated people with autoimmune disease, connective tissue disease. Now, the same researcher to whom I just referred has spoken on this and acknowledged that there are anecdotal reports of autoimmune flares after getting the Shingrix vaccine. So now they're going to be conducting the clinical trial that hopefully will get some answers on that, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about it. In the meantime, I personally, given that I do struggle with some autoimmunity issues, I do get very concerned about the adjuvants in the vaccines. So let's fast forward to right now with all the good news out there with the messenger RNA vaccines, both showing over 90% effective against COVID-19. And for those of you who didn't see my interview with the clinical research team who was doing some of the trials on Moderna, the messenger RNA vaccines don't use adjuvants. So I am super excited about that because given that I do struggle with autoimmune disease, I am planning to get vaccinated against COVID either way, but the fact that there is something out there that doesn't use an adjuvant, I find to be particularly comforting. I don't know as much yet about any of these vaccines as I would like to, and I'm sure that we're all going to continue to learn more, and I want to talk more about them as they come to market. But I'm just really excited that it looks like the first ones that are coming to market are the messenger RNA vaccines. It's a really novel technology. Now, I have read some sobering things about them too. I read one potential indictment that had to do with autoimmunity, although there was no explanation given. Looking and drilling down as deeply as I do, I couldn't find a thing to justify that concern. It doesn't mean that it's not possible that there's an issue with autoimmunity, but I think there's always that concern anyway for the reason I just stated. And I think the fact that the messenger RNA vaccines, given that they don't use an adjuvant, I think that bodes really well for those of us with autoimmune disease. I'm looking forward to hearing what people who have studied it have to say. Now, I read another, what sounded like kind of an indictment saying that, well, we don't know how long it's going to provide immunity for. I don't think that's really a fair indictment of a vaccine. I'm sure if we only get 10 years of immunity from this, we'll get some more later, or we'll have something else by that time. But I just don't think there's going to be any alternative in our population other than to become vaccinated against this. If you Google number of COVID cases, you'll see a graph, and there'll be a drop-down menus where you can find certain regions, certain countries, and what have you. And it looks to me like in countries that thought that they would just let this go and they would develop herd immunity, that really hasn't happened with COVID. So I don't see how we're going to get herd immunity other than through a vaccine. So me personally, I am really excited about the messenger RNA vaccines. I am looking forward to learning a lot more in the coming weeks. My guess is it's not going to be widely available still for some time. I think I read that Pfizer is going to have about 20 million doses. It seems to me that that would be about enough to get first responders and healthcare workers vaccinated. Now, I read that shortly before we got the latest news, which is that Moderna came along and had its data ready. So I don't know, does Moderna have 20 million doses ready to go? You know, that's only going to add to what we have available. So I think this is all good news. And I'm really excited about all of us maybe getting our lives back sometime soon. So I am interested in hearing what you guys have to say about it. I know that people have very strong feelings about vaccines, and I am a member on several Facebook discussion groups for all different nursing specialties, even though I'm a nurse anesthetist, but there's a lot of interesting discussions in all the nursing groups. And I am shocked that it seems to go group by group, but in at least one of the groups I can think of, people are pretty anti-vaccine, which I think is kind of a mistake. But I am interested in what my viewers think about it. What are your thoughts on it? Are you excited about it? What are your fears about it? What are your concerns? And maybe there's some questions that we can get answered over the next couple of months. So let me know if you enjoyed this and if it was helpful to you. And until next time, be well. Bye-bye.